So one of the topics, Bria, that came up recently um, from an adult who works with kids is, we talk a lot about making sure that our interactions with kids are based on equity, right? That we can't get rid of the power we have uh, because we're larger, more experienced, have more resources, et cetera. We can't get rid of that power, but we talk a lot about how do we make sure to take those extra steps to make sure we're engaging from a default of equitable kind of engagement with really any human being. And especially kids, because often our autopilot is to operate from a place of power, to use language that implies power, to et cetera. And so, how do we overcome that? And then the question was, well, how do we intervene, or do we, when we are working in a space, or let's say I'm a parent, I have multiple kids, or I'm working in a learning center or a school where there's multiple kids, and there are kids who are powering down on other kids. What's our how do we approach that, especially if we're trying to do it in a way that isn't defaulting to the power that we do have to intervene or shape that experience in a way that we want it to be. So it's, I think it's a real thing for a lot of people, and it's a real challenge when you are trying to operate from a place of equity, and yet we don't have a lot of training or language around that. So that's the topic that I wanted to bring today, to see if we could provide any guidance or framing from our experience in working in those spaces and in coaching people to help adults that want to approach that from a place of equity and co-creation rather than power. What do we recommend?
Yeah, I think the first thing, and something you said during the chore, when we were talking about chores, actually made me think of this, but the first thing I would want people to know is that the way we talk to kids is showing them how they should be in their relationships. So if we're talking from a very power over authoritarian place, then they're going to use that in their relationships with younger kids because they see themselves as having more power than the younger kids, so they can act that way. It's one way for them to get power when they might feel powerless. It's one way for them to practice what they're seeing the tools of the culture are, because they're seeing adults act this way towards each other and towards them. So a lot of times I would say if that's coming up a lot, then there's something in maybe in your family system or in the school they're at or community they're a part of that's showing them that's how you should relate to people younger than you or to other people in general. So first I would say think that through and shift your own behavior accordingly so they're not getting those messages. That being said, systems of power and control are everywhere, and we cannot shield our kids from experiencing those and thinking that's a way that people behave that people behave to get what they want when it really is. So they're everywhere and they're still going to get those messages. So it's still going to come up regardless of how you're acting. It's just going to come up, I think, a lot more if it's super prevalent in their like community and family partnerships.
Yeah, I would second that usually when people are doing it, it's because they are experiencing it being done to them.
Yeah.
And often human beings, we need to feel that we have power over our lives, or we don't feel good and don't feel human. And if in some spaces we have it taken away, then we are going to take it away from others in order to come to some kind of what feels like a little bit of equilibrium. In something you mentioned in there really reminded me that there are, if we are often coming from a place of power in our interactions with kids, and we then step into a situation where we see that kind of power use between kids and ask them to be equitable and restorative and kind of nonviolent in their language use, it is absolutely not going to work. even if we're using all the right language and all of, just because they will immediately recognize hypocrisy
Mm-hmm.
and that we are not a reliable or trustful or trustable actor.
Mm-hmm.
And so if you jump from, always telling kids what to do to empowering on them to then saying, be equitable, it's 100% not going to work. However, a way to kind of to do that transition that I think is honest. I mean, coming to that with honesty is one way that I recommend approaching that, which is, um, whether you're talking to those two kids together or separately, and often, those techniques, um, there's a lot behind whether you approach a situation kind of in the moment or after, and whether it's both the kids or separately. And I think restorative justice and restorative practices um, often has some good systems and mechanisms to help understand when to do it in those different ways. As we've talked about before, all of those systems can be subverted and hacked to be used for oppression and violence rather than to support it. They can often be interpreted through the lens of privilege in ways that can actually end up being damaging. So with any of those, be careful with nonviolent communication, restorative practices. But with those understandings, they can be great tools to help us understand that. But whether you're talking to the individual or to both, I think if we have previously come from a place of non-equity, to kneel down if they're smaller, as I will often do when I'm making an ask or an observation, and just say, you know what, I want to recognize that I often am acting like I get to say how things are because I'm bigger and older, et cetera. And I want to recognize that, or I have recognized that that actually isn't okay. And I want to apologize that I have done that with you in the past. And I really want to commit to moving forward to recognizing that it's actually not an okay way to get what I want. And I'm noticing also that whether maybe you learned it from me or I don't know where, but this is something that I observed in, your interaction with that other kid that felt to me like it might have been using your power over them to get what you want in a way that might not be in line with who you actually want to be and how you want to do things. And I just wanted to check in on that because I think maybe they were that there's another way to get what you want, and there's a way for everybody to kind of feel okay in negotiating that. And so that's, we're always in transition with kids, or almost always, even when we're really trying to be equitable,
Mm-hmm.
even if it's because just other adults are often that way with them. So we kind of have to own that. It's like, hey, even if it's like, hey, I want to recognize that we often relate equitably, but that most, this other stuff's happening out there.
Yeah.
And let's talk about that, and let's talk about this situation, if that's okay with you. And I'm stepping in because I felt like maybe somebody was getting hurt, and that's why I'm stepping in. Otherwise, I would not be up in your business. And can we talk about that?
Yeah. Yeah. I love that way of approaching it, like owning it first, especially if you know that maybe some of those things came from you or came from their direct environment that you share. Yeah, it's really important to honestly own that. I would add that maybe inviting them to tell you when you're doing it. So, like right now, I'm telling you what I saw. Would you be willing to let me know when you see me doing that to you or to someone else? If you invite that and you commit to showing them that that's okay and they do it, then you have to listen. um, you, of course, we're all going to have our reactions and feelings, but you have to be like really open to hearing it because they're gonna do it and it might feel harsh and hard, and you can really shut it down pretty quickly if you react in a bad way or in a power over kind of way when they call it out. But that's something I really like to mention, is that I actually do want to be held accountable and I don't always know when I'm doing it, and I prefer it coming from the kids themselves often. So I will say that, like, please hold me accountable
Hmm.
in the same way. And can we do that for each other? How does that sound to you?
I think that's a great point, Bria, and really in a good rule of thumb, I think, whether it's with adults or kids, is anytime we feel that it's justifiable or important, or for whatever reason that we want to offer or suggest that another human being change their behavior,
Mm.
it's important that we make the invitation, or make it clear that we don't assume that that's only a one-way street.
Yeah.
And kids, and in working with adults in all kinds of situations, where we do explicitly try to do that, it often takes lots of invitations for kids to believe us that it's
Yes.
true. So we can't just say it once and expect that they're going to just start, going up to adults and saying, "Hey," but I think that it is a critical element. Um, I would also say that just in general, in any community that we're in, um, it's important for everybody in it to talk about what our expectations are about how we relate with each other. So whether it's in a family or a learning center or a school, um, to get clear on what we expect if we see things happening where we feel like somebody might be being hurt by the way an interaction is happening, and what are the expectations. And actually, there's a school that I'm working with where the teachers, said, we actually would like to have the kids be able to expect that we will engage in certain ways. Like, we want to be held accountable to ways of engaging, so the kids can know that if we do see a situation like that happening, that if we are going to engage, it's going to be based on these guidelines. That it's going to be that we don't assume that our need for what we see happening there is more important than the people's needs who are in it. That we will use language that that doesn't that is non-judgmental, right? And that just that describes observation without judgment, or that doesn't assume guilt or innocence or those kinds of things, right? And for a community to get clear on what needs are and how we expect we're going to engage with each other, just by doing that, you're going to start to see less of kids powering on each other. And the more you adhere to the agreements you make as an adult in how you kind of enforce or just reinforce the group's guidelines, which, by the way, should be the expectation of everybody in it. Because if the expectation is it's the adult's job to enforce the agreements, which is often how it works, then it becomes the adult's thing, and it still is a power. So, holding the kids accountable by reminding them and asking, "Hey, it's my need. This is what I often will do with kids. I don't really think it's fair that I should be the only one that upholds our group agreements in terms of how we interact with each other. I would really appreciate it if we could all do that." And that's partly where that invitation comes into. I know I break our agreements sometimes, and maybe a good way to practice would be calling me out on those as well. So clarity is just important in any relationship, right? And doing that process with inviting that process in our communities is a way to lay a foundation. You're still going to have those incidents you have to step into because somebody's getting hurt, and you feel that it's important that somebody step in and help people recognize that. But it really does limit them, in my experience. What do you think, Bria? What else around this? I mean, there's so much around what our role is, and how to go about it when we see. And this can be true of adults if you see it between adults too, right?
Mhm.
If we witness one adult interacting with another adult where they're using power or in some other way inflicting harm, what is our responsibility and our role, and how do we approach it when we do? the techniques really should be the same,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And if we think they should be different, then are young humans somehow different, not human in some way or something, right? Um, yeah.
Yeah, and I think having those explicit community agreements made by and for everyone about how you intervene is deeply important,
Mhm.
as you said and explained. Because then it's also sometimes adults interfering with adults can get contentious in different ways. People
Yeah.
can feel looked down upon. There's a lot going on there. But if you have those explicit agreements by this is just how we relate and how we address things together, then you're able to be receptive to it because you've consented to interacting that way and to needing that feedback. You've said, like, I need to hear and be called out when this is happening, and we all need that together. And you've consented to that kind of
Yeah.
communication and agreement. Yeah. And I think that it's totally unfair to say that it should be different for kid to kid or adult to kid or adult to adult interactions. It should be community wide, and how you're reacting to each other in
Right.
all should be similar.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Something you said there made me think about it. Helping everybody understand kind of what's the social contract in our community around how do we ask for help and how do we offer help? I think are
Yeah.
two really, really important things. If we're in a situation where we feel from either side, if there's a power imbalance or whatever, maybe it's even power equal and they're having trouble, how do we, what are some signs that we need help, whatever age, size, whatever we are, and how do we make the ask? And
Mm-hmm.
from folks. And if we see something happening where we think people might need help, how do we make that offer in a way that is in line with the values of our community? And I think that in terms of that question of how do we support that in others, all whether it's adults or kids, always comes down to that. What are our values and expectations as a community, and what are some agreements we have in terms of how we ask for and offer help when there's conflict? So conflict resolution is really the kind of the topic, I think, retroactively labeling it here, right, that we're talking about. And the principles, I think it's so important to remember that the principles are the same no matter the age of the human. The
Yeah.
words we use to enact or call up those principles, or the vocabulary we use, might be different depending on the age and the situation, but the principles that work are always the same, I think is something that's really important to remember. Um,
Yeah. And we do have to remember that those things are the same, and we do have more power over younger people and more maybe abuse of that power in our past to get through, work through, and shift before we can feel equitable in those relationships. There might be more there than when you're interacting with an adult in that way. Maybe
Great
there's.
point. Our ability to act from those places is probably going to be different based on the kind of relational,
Yeah.
social contract, conditioning, assumptions, etc. And so, and I do find that it's often much more difficult to support kids in conflict um, because of those assumptions we're bringing about our power over them than it is to help adults. Um, it's more socially acceptable and it's more normal for an adult to step into kids having conflict than it is for an adult to step into other adults having conflict. Like that's more socially expected by everybody. But it's much harder to come at it from a place of equity when we do it when it's kids, I
Yeah.
guess is kind of how I would think about that.
Yeah. It's
Um, mhm.
me will start from the problem amongst kids or that we see coming up between kids. And then as we talk about it, we realize it's a very human thing and it comes up in all of our interactions, and it's not based on age. It's really based on just how we interact and how we need to learn and unlearn and relearn those dynamics. It really applies to all of us.
Yeah. And that makes me think that I think one of the challenges is that when we see kids having conflict, we often don't value the thing that they're having conflict over, right? We're like, oh, you're kidding me? You're fighting over a toy? You know what I mean? It's like when if we think that what they're doing is about something that's not important, we're going to dismiss them as people. Whereas when adults are fighting, we'd be like, oh yeah, I can understand why you're fighting over that. And
Yeah.
I think that comes to me right now, that's, I think one of the challenges is it's hard to kind of put, this is where empathy really comes in. We need to really come at it from a place of, again, their need being as valuable as ours, even if we don't understand it. To that
Yes.
kid right then, the need for that toy is just as important to them as my need for something that I think is important is to me. And if we don't recognize that, it's going to be difficult to be able to support that situation, I think. And it's hard to look at kids fighting over something that, I mean, when I look at my, 15-year-old boys versus my 11-year-old daughter, they are constantly dismissing the things she's into that they were into 2 years ago, right? They're like, oh, that's so childish, whatever. And so imagine a 30, 20, year difference of like, wow, you think that's important? Gosh, get over it, right? But it is important to them, and it's important that we recognize that when we step in and don't dismiss, I think, the thing that they're having conflict over.
Yeah, especially if we want them to recognize what's important to us when we're asking them to recognize
Exactly.
our needs.
Yeah.
Yeah,
When
the
they look
11.
at us, they're like, "You think a clean room's important?"
Yeah,
I'm like,
that's
what's
a
wrong
lot of.
with you?
It's the same when it's not clean. Like
Yeah.
what? Yeah.
Get over it, man. Yeah. Cool. Well, plenty more to talk about as usual, but do you want to take us out? We'll wrap this one and talk again another time. What do you think? What are some good closing words on this for us, Bria?
We went through a lot here. I mean, I think with anything, the first thing I'm going to say is think about your own actions and how what you're doing is conveying a message to the young people you're around and how that affects how they think they should be treating people and responding to others. So yeah, first, like look at yourself and your environment and think about how that is affecting the situation. And then just always keep in mind what we've said over and over, I feel like, which is needs are equitable. As Aaron would put, that doesn't mean they're always equal or they're like both needs can always win out at the same time, but you have to not consider you as an adult having a need as more important simply because you're an adult. So I would always work from those two bases. And I think that really applies here when we're thinking very largely about this like conflict within a community and between people.